Thank you for having me. I sometimes joke that being a researcher of technology ethics means that I make slides like this over and over until I retire. Uh, I especially focus actually on ethics education for computing and research ethics for computer science and data science. And so those are what I'm going to be making some opening remarks about specifically. So when we see controversies in the news, and we certainly see a lot that are related to AI and also various aspects of mobile technology, location tracking is a great example. We sometimes see responses like this, which was specifically about Zoom bombing, and I think most people are familiar with Zoom bombing by now. And when questioned about kind of how all of this went wrong, the CEO of Zoom said that they hadn't thought about potential misuses of the technology. And I've been thinking about how how technologists think about things ahead of time, the kinds of problems that we anticipate. And one common way of thinking about problems in the technology process is technical debt. So there's this idea that we know that there's going to be problems in some technology that's released. There's going to be bugs, but we don't know what they're going to be. So let's push it out, and once we see what the bugs are, we'll fix it. And this is especially the case when wanting to get things to market quickly, etc. And if the button on a particular form doesn't work, it's not going to be too much trouble to fix it later. But I've been thinking about an analog concept of ethical debt, which is what's the implied cost of not considering social and ethical implications of harms during the design process. And again, the idea, well, this new technology, it's probably going to have some impact on society. It's possible there's going to be, some social issues, some privacy issues, et cetera, but we don't know what they're going to be. So we'll fix it after we see what they are. But in this case, the harm's already been done, right? You can't undo the people who were Zoom bombed and had people yelling racial slurs at them, etc. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about this as well is in the context of these controversies and how this to me implies some things about ethics education. So for example, Cambridge Analytica was a huge example of a big tech ethics scandal. And one of the common responses that I heard in the media and from people on social media, et cetera, was like, why is no one teaching these computer scientists ethics? I just don't understand. So this was an op-ed that was written by a former Google engineer, and he had this statement that really resonated with me, and it was this idea that software engineers can treat safety and ethics as specialties rather than the foundations of all design. And at the time I thought, oh yeah, this actually makes a lot of sense, and it makes a lot of sense that this is a problem because this is very often how we teach ethics. And I did this sort of response at the time with this pithy tagline that if you work in tech and you're not thinking about ethics, you're bad at your job. But I do think that one of the reasons that we sometimes get this mindset that ethics is for someone else to think about, right? Like, I'm just the engineer, I'm just the programmer, I'm all for hire a philosopher for every product team if we want to do that, but that's not happening, right? And there's someone whose job it is on a construction site to be the safety engineer. That's a specialty, but that doesn't mean that the person putting up the drywall sees a live wire and walks by. It's like, well, that's for the safety engineer to figure out. Everyone needs to be thinking about it. And I think that that's also part of how we should be teaching ethics in computing as part of technical classes. And so that's one of the things that I've been working on in my research is how to do that. And also for people who are interested in thinking more about the kinds of things that can be taught to technologists in terms of ethics, a few years ago, I crowdsourced this giant collection of tech ethics syllabi. And interestingly, they're from lots of different disciplines. They're not all taught in computer science, but some of them are. They're taught by people in different departments, et cetera. And also as part of this, my students and I did a big analysis of these syllabi to see sort of what kinds of topics were taught, et cetera. And as part of that, also looked at whether ethics was being taught as in part of specifically AI classes. And the answer is sometimes, but not as often as we might like. And another thing I want to mention is that, you know, this issue of controversies and things that we might be not thinking about, potential harms, et cetera, also happens in research. So I've been doing work on research ethics and computing for a while. And this is a big conversation right now, is what is our responsibility of researchers to be thinking about the impacts and potential harms of our work. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, there was this article in the New Yorker, Who Should Stop Unethical AI? And it's actually all about research. So it's a bit about the controversies that have been happening in the NeurIPS community, for example, around ethics as being considered in part of the review process, and there being more calls to consider the impacts of work, et cetera. I have for many years now been part of the research ethics committee for SIGCHI. And one of the things that we do is consider, is give advice on ethical issues that come up during the paper review process. And I think the HCI community in particular has been thinking about this kind of thing for a long time, but as this article points out, computer science does not tend to have as many checkpoints for ethics as some other disciplines that contain more human subjects research. So, you know, for those of you who are in the United States, relying on IRBs or you know, other types of ethical review boards, you know, isn't going to work for a lot of the types of potential harms in computer science. And so the question that I tend to go back to is whether we're thinking about the unintended consequences of our work in order to mitigate types of ethical debt. And so this is some of the work that I'm doing right now, is how might we scaffold speculation about harms during the design process in order to try to cut some things off and mitigate harms before we get to them, so that you know, we as researchers or the CEOs of companies don't end up having to give answers like this when there are scandals in the news or in our community, et cetera. And I'm looking forward to having more of a discussion about this.
This is great. So the next speaker is Dia. Oscar.
Thank you for having me. It's really nice that you know, Mirko and the organizing committee actually just arranged this panel. I think it's great that we have this discussion in the computer science community, as well as like social science and policy and legal scholars as well. I'm a social scientist, and for more than a decade now, I've been working on how we make use of emerging information and communication technologies in general, and mobile communication technologies and media in particular. I research and explore the societal implications of emerging technologies. And my short talk today will be along the lines of a provocation instead of presentation of key facts and figures from my empirical research. And I have been researching mostly how we use mobile communication technologies, mobile computing and media in the context of mundane everyday practices since mid-2000. And I have always been fascinated with the creative and unexpected uses of technologies, how users incorporate or embed the tools and devices that are out there, created and designed by you, like computer scientists, and how they interact and communicate with them, through them, and in some cases, despite of them. But at the same time, I have come across many examples where new or emerging technologies reproduce existing inequalities and contribute to the creation of new ones in societies. So while certain privileged groups benefit from technological advancements and enjoy their benefits, certain other groups end up suffering the negative consequences of these developments, the most, if that's the right way to put it. And the tools and methods that we develop and design come to touch, at the end of the day, almost every single aspect of our lives. And in this regard, my approach and understanding the wider societal and ethical implications of AI, mobile communication technologies and computing, including not only smartphone in the most banal sense, but also the data infrastructures, geographies, materialities, including the networks, design principles, protocols, standards, metrics, and most importantly, how these assemblages reconfigure our relationships with each other as individuals, communities, populations, and different stakeholders. In that sense, my approach to exploring the implications and discussing the ethical questions around this is based on focused ethnographic work that are bottom-up rather than top-down. What I mean by this is that regulations, guidelines, and principles that definitely help protect the rights of the users, for sure, but they somehow, I feel, that fail short of incorporating the sense of real life and real life scenarios in different social, political, cultural, and economic contexts, as they end up being taken usually for granted, especially by regulators or by technologists. Then as users of these technologies, we start to lose the already limited agency that we have, and our concerns, needs, and worries, unfortunately, end up being overlooked by especially the people who end up designing these technologies and using them. I had the pleasure of attending some of the sessions yesterday as part of HotMobile, and I also managed to look through some of the papers that I missed. With my kind of critical social science hat. One thing that struck me was that the questions we are asking as a community were inevitably, of course, focused on developing technologies that were overcoming certain technical problems or fixing them in that sense, or for example, increasing efficiency of human users in completing certain tasks and so on. Of course, these are the key ontological disciplinary questions, and they're important and they need to exist and help us solve important problems and challenges that the world is facing today. But I believe that we also need to put them in the social context and discuss their wider societal implications. At the end of the day, technologies do not exist in a vacuum. They are social constructs. Smartphones are social constructs. Data is a social construct. AI is a social construct. If we isolate them from their wider societal context, then we miss the opportunity to see the broader picture where people's lives bear the consequences of the small technical and design decisions that you guys make when designing and developing these systems. An example of it is actually in the last decade, we can see that the world has witnessed many crises in relation to especially mobilities and movements such as displacements, forced migrations, global warming, climate change, endemics, and pandemics. These crises of mobilities have surfaced actually how technologies of mass surveillance and data analytics are used to predict movements of people, information, and objects, and how such technologies of control are employed to overcome uncertainties caused by crisis. For example, in the US, the Department of Homeland Security deployed and used services from data analytics firm Palantir to kind of monitor immigration and control the air travelers. Although, for example, that companies' data practices came under scrutiny in relation to, in some circles, human rights violations, in the UK, an example, the Home Office similarly awarded the same company to kind of manage their borders and use their data analytics and architectures right after UK left the EU in December 2020. So when we look at these examples, another recent example is like how data analytics are used to control crisis, especially of mobilities, is of course what we are living in at the moment, COVID-19. So technology companies, including like Amazon, Microsoft, and the others, have been offering their services to track and control the spread of COVID-19 in communities in different contexts. And a lot of these systems have been like, for example, the ones used by Palantir using machine learning models for predicting the location of the outbreaks to determine where to help determine where to kind of deploy medical staff or supplies, for example. However, such predictions are not only used to plan distribution of medical supplies, they are also and can be also used to check whether people comply with social distancing rules based on community mobility reports, profiles of places, and hands of people. Therefore, the immediate response, I feel that to any type of crisis, especially crisis of mobilities, seem to be found in quick technological predictive solutions like fixes, whether they subjugate the civil liberties and human rights or not. The use of these predictive and preemptive tools to govern mobilities in that sense raises many questions about their societal implications and ethics. For example, what kinds of inferences can be made or are being made about people and places that visit those places, and how? How do such inferences end up influencing the practices of our everyday lives? What kinds of decisions can be made based on those automatic inferences about people and places, and how such decisions influence our physical and social interaction and mobilities, and how they reconfigure and reinforce existing inequalities in societies. So when we look at the broader societal context, then in the sense of like, we are of course living in capitalist society, especially in the West, and capitalism thrives on crisis and fears uncertainty. And that's why capitalist systems like to fix things for stability, like stable economies, financial markets, forecasted growth and return on investment, and etc. Interestingly, though, as one of the prominent geographers in the field, Nigel Thrift, in his book wrote, Knowing Capitalism, argues uncertainty is also used as a resource by capitalist systems, where it is acknowledged that, and I quote, nothing can be permanently fixed, end quote. That is why public and private technology companies are capitalizing on crisis of mobilities and positioning them as causes of uncertainty and sometimes as things to be fixed. And one of the key things in that sense that we need to think about and discuss is this realization of this logic and put technologies that we're developing back into their social context instead of isolating them from their wider societal context. And the key here, of course, according to my social science perspective, would be to include the people, the communities, who bear especially the negative consequences of these technologies the most, such as marginalized groups and vulnerable groups. Cultural and political contexts are also very important. For example, while solving a design problem in a Western developed democratic society, we may come up with a technological fix, and that fix might work well in that context at that time. But when it is employed in another cultural or political context, then the consequences could be, again, like kind of harming the civil rights and liberties and freedoms. A very recent example of this is again like COVID pandemic and how different governments around the world responded, especially in the first early stages with the use of smartphone apps. That is great, yes, we can use these small devices that are almost the extensions of our bodies, meaning that they're always with us and on us. But what happens when, for example, the heat maps that are used to visualize crowded spaces are used to control people's right to a peaceful protest? Or what happens when some governments change and implement laws that allow 24/7 constant tracking of citizens based on their data from their smartphones using COVID-19 as a legitimate reason? Then, so who gets to decide who has the rights to or not to our data, but also, most importantly, our lives? So in that sense, I wondered what kinds of societies and futures we are building and will leave for our children. And I asked this question to children themselves. So I conducted an ethnographic research in primary and secondary schools in London, UK, almost around 1.5 or 2 years ago. And I asked children aged around like 8 to 12, what they think about their mobile phones, about data, about who may know where they are, or about AI. And this was one of the responses that I got, which I will now show you. So this is, yes, exactly. So this was like from some of the work that I did with the children. So I asked them to build like little models or draw like kind of images when I asked them questions so we could use them as props. So this is like some of the key things that I think, like what kind of futures, digital futures that we're developing are going to leave to the future of this world. It's like a little bit scary. And really, like, I wasn't guiding them in any way or shape or form, because that would be unethical. But what we see here is like, this is the image of technologies, and a lot of things that are like they're hearing and seeing about are leaving in their minds, in their lives. So I think this is quite important in that sense, that we pay particular attention to societal contexts and what happens when we develop technologies, and whether how we envisage them and how we envisage their implications will be are really there. And most importantly, maybe what their consequences are, and also their limitations. So do we consider the limitations of the technologies that we develop when it comes to providing solutions, the way that we envisage, and at the end, yeah, what kind of digital features are we building? So that would be my provocation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So, Jo?
Thanks also from my side for having me in this conference, and like to contribute a bit to the discussion also in this panel, this highly interesting panel, and also building a bit already what has been said by the former speakers, especially picking up also what Didem was talking about, technologies being kind of social constructs, which is kind of also my perspective on how I look at what technologies are. And this might not be evident for the kind of audience in this type of conference, as you are indeed mainly engaged with developing technologies as efficiently and as good as possible. But we need to understand, of course, that these technologies are kind of have built-in values one way or another. A nice example you could say is when we taking perhaps a more legal perspective, the notion of privacy by design as a concept which is very essential in for legal scholars at GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is from my side the most vivid example of what it means when you develop a technology from early stages. You need to think of some kind of fundamental value, at least in European sense, it's a fundamental value. Privacy meaning data protection. And so this means that every step, the next step you take when developing this technology, you need to have this in your mind. For example, talking about data minimization, that you only process the amount of data which is necessary for having a good operating app, for example, a good operating software. So in that sense, privacy by design, data protection by design is a very important concept, I would say. Now, the reason I'm also participating in this panel is that I have been working recently on together with scholars in other universities in Utrecht and others on some ideas about how to better understand what technologies mean for people in everyday use. And in that sense, it kind of links up in the ethnographic work Didem is doing, I would say, is that my main proposition is, and I might want to show something here if that's successful. Is let me show this if that works. Share. I'm not sure this will. No, this does not work. No, that doesn't work apparently here. Anyway. What happened at a certain moment at the beginning of, I will tell it then, I had a graph of what happened with WhatsApp at a certain moment at the beginning of this year, that there was a huge exodus of WhatsApp users to Signal and Telegram. 2.5 million people switched to Signal, 22 million switched to Telegram for one reason or another. And the reason was that WhatsApp suddenly in January 6 announced that it would start sharing its data with Facebook more than in the past. And you wouldn't have any kind of way of stopping that except by not using WhatsApp anymore. Everywhere in the world except Europe, because Europe has a GDPR and they are not allowed to do that there, but everywhere else they are. And apparently this was a shock for many people, while most people, insiders and people investigating this, were not so much surprised by that. But for many people it was apparently. And so this led to the fact that the healthy choice, I would say, that many people switch from a corporate data-driven technology to a more privacy-oriented technology, being Signal, which is not built on commodification of user data. So the reason I'm using this example is to make my point is that what I see happening and what I'm looking at as I'm looking at it is that when you have technologies like the example of messaging apps, and you can also use examples in education or in other areas of mobility or other application fields, but now using the example of a messaging app as a basic tool, as an essential tool for most people for everyday social communication, what you see is that they are kind of built as entangled infrastructures. What do I mean with that? So on the one hand, people feel these kind of technologies, these kind of services, these kind of apps have become a social infrastructure. Facebook itself even calls it a social infrastructure in their manifestos, in their public debate. They say, well, we want to become the social infrastructure of people. So they see it themselves, and people experience this also themselves. So they become kind of indispensable gatekeepers for everyday life interaction. And in that sense, they become compelled of using them because, yeah, their friends are using it. And if you don't have access, you are kind of outsider and you're kind of excluded of many debates and many contacts you have. But at the same time, by doing that, they need to trust also these systems that they are working in the benefit and in of themselves. And there, of course, there comes the problem in the sense that what my premise is that by forcing people to have them as social infrastructures, they also commodify, of course, all the data which is being shared through these technologies, and to a large extent at the expense of public values, which we hold dear in democracies, like privacy, like transparency, like non-discrimination, and others. So that's a kind of the problem, that these social infrastructures are entangled with what you could call the computational corporate infrastructure. The computational corporate infrastructure is the kind of way these systems are built from a business perspective, trying to link up with advertisers, trying to link up with other apps that kind of sharing data among different apps, and even with loyalty cards in supermarkets and everywhere else. But also being built from a technical side, like in the sense that to have the largest amount of data capturing and sharing without people being informed really about it. This links a bit to other scholars talking about surveillance capitalism, data colonialism, and other kind of issues. But anyway, so what's happened is that you see that these two infrastructures, social infrastructures and computational corporate infrastructures, are being entangled consciously, but people are not aware of this. So, and the way to get out of this is what I would call then, what is called also in science and technology studies, infrastructural inversion. What does it mean? It means that people only become aware of the kind of infrastructure they are entangled with at the moment the infrastructure is not working or is disappearing, or somebody else is surfacing stuff they were not aware of that it was happening. So it's kind of, I did an experiment, an ethnographic experiment with my students, and asked them to not use 3 types of social media for 4 days in a row, which was a huge disruption class, because that was very difficult, and a lot of them didn't succeed in that, and most of them had to really delete their apps from their smartphone in order to do the exercise, but otherwise they couldn't survive and couldn't not use it. But this generated a lot of insights in how essential these things are, but also start them reflecting about, well, what is it doing to my life? And when you look at then another way of infrastructure inversion, so one is then not using it, the other one is surfacing the infrastructure which you're not aware of, like the example with WhatsApp that start saying, well, we're going to share more data with Facebook. And then people said, well, what is the alternative? Well, apparently Signal and Telegram are more privacy friendly, although Telegram is disputable to a large extent, I would say. But anyway, people still look for alternative, and it helped them to reflect on how to get out of this kind of entangled infrastructural situation. So my point is in the end that if we want to help users in having better technologies and understand, being aware of it, and being empowered in engaging with these technologies, we need to help them to create transparency and explainability about these kind of tools, and to help them understand what are these technologies doing on a social level to me and being dependent on them, But at the same time, while being dependent, how are they misusing possibly the data I'm sharing within these systems? And how can I get a grip on that? How can I get insights on that? And then from that side, of course, as technologists, we can help them. We can help develop tools, privacy enhancing tools. We can help develop tools that give alternatives to existing systems that are adhering to public values like privacy and transparency and trustworthiness. So we can do that, but we need to do this in such a way that people can have a choice and can have an alternative besides the traditional systems which we have at this moment. So this is kind of the point I want to make. And I gave the example of messaging app, but you see this happening in many different sectors, also in education, especially due to COVID, for example. We see an acceleration of higher education rushing to technologies which do not have an educational value, but just a commercial value, and do these technologies and have the same kind of values that universities are looking for when they implement these kind of technologies within their educational system. So again, how to be sure that these technologies do the thing we want them to do from a public interest perspective. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jo. Thanks for your statement and for your statement. So we are going to move to Chidem. Chidem.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak in this panel. And listening to others, I think what I'm going to say is going to complement what has already been said. When I think about the ethics, the keywords of this panel, ethics, the IoT, the AI, and the image that came to my mind was these eggs, actually, fragile technology held in a very delicate balance. And I was thinking that it also distills my own experience as a researcher, as a systems person, that worked in Internet of Things, but both in a public and private space, as well as having talked to people who worked in legal tech, design, and I always thought that we really, really maintain a very delicate balance with the technology that we're creating. And in the rest of the presentation, I'll show you a few images and quotes that basically explain my thinking a little bit. I've used these similar images in a design workshop with an interdisciplinary design workshop with people from systems, engineering, designers, and law recently, and it elicited a very different kind of responses. And we mainly focused on the home IoT systems, and that's what I'm going to do today as well. So the first quote that came to my mind when I think about the Internet of Things is going back to the principles and how we envisioned Internet of Things driven systems. We always thought about these intelligent devices seamlessly connected at the background, gathering our information, and they did what they did, not necessarily telling us anything. It was part of the vision. And I think we were not scared of this future because we thought these devices were there to help us, relieve us from the complexity of our everyday lives. So our devices are going to be at the background, learning about us, providing at the beginning interfaces that looked similar to our mobile phones that we can interact, and they were just going to solve our problems and help us with our daily lives. As the devices changed forms and slowly started blending into our everyday environments, we started thinking, even forgetting their presence, that they are there doing their thing, silently listening to our conversations and analyzing our data. And this may not be so important if we didn't share our spaces with other people. And our homes are shared spaces. We share them with our family, and our family members include very young, as in this picture, as well as elderly people who may not as technologically savvy. A majority of the time, they are not decision makers. They are not party to purchase decisions, but their data is part of what's being collected and analyzed and learned from. Finally, while we are maybe more comfortable with having these devices in our shared spaces like living rooms and maybe kitchens, we are not necessarily haven't thought about other places where we want to keep to ourselves, but they are entering our most private spaces at home too, as the private and public lines, demarcation lines are blurring at home, especially with COVID-19, where I just explained that I am running away from my 3-year-old who's in another part of the house, right? Business and personal lives have completely blended into one. And finally, the final point I want to make is that with wearables especially, we are allowing these devices to collect sensitive data as labeled as sensitive in general data protection regulation, 24/7. And these slides are not to dismiss the benefits that we're driving from these devices. I do want to acknowledge that. We do, with quantitative self, have learned more about ourselves. Maybe these devices have great use in remote healthcare, especially in a pandemic situation. They might have helped with providing healthcare remotely, as well as for mental well-being as well, in the isolation situations that we find ourselves. And I see that despite the hacks and privacy issues that majority of us have discussed, people will feel the need to get these devices, IoT devices at home more and more, and feel a reward from doing so. And they will feel like their life will be difficult if they don't have. And we will see an increase in the number of devices that are going to be used until probably this point. And I think this is going back to Jo's point of people start seeing problems when things go wrong. And I just took a few examples from that made the headlines. The Englishman spends 11 hours making a cup of tea was a few years back, where AWS, and I think everybody knows Hamed in this community, that was very recent, where people started seeing that when connectivity breaks and outages happen, the devices that supposed to be smart, intelligent, help with their everyday lives cannot even do what the dumb devices are supposed to do. So you cannot even boil a kettle of water when the connectivity is off, and everything stops functioning as they used to. And I think the final point that I want to make is that we want to, I think, reconsider the way we design these systems and how they are put together and give more control back to its users. And the challenge is to give back control to users without overwhelming them. How can we create more transparent interfaces that show what the devices collect as data? How can we make it a choice to decide when to connect and when to a device and to the internet, and when to satisfy with local connectivity and device still can perform some intelligent functionality? And how do we change our decision making so we don't need to stick with our initial preferences, but change the way we use our devices as we change the way we use our homes and spaces with the people in them and and changing situations. And this is an effort that requires interdisciplinary research, people that are from the social sciences, policy spaces, legal tech, systems engineers, people that work in access control and security. They need to understand and work together with each other. And this is the final point I want to make. This is interdisciplinary research because we deserve better than this. And that's my final point.